Thank you. I just have a few questions that also have to do with financing. Although I must admit, when you started talking about tunnels, I got really nervous. Well, we're talking about another financing plan that isn't quite beefed up. I think where's the beef is a good comment by the chair. Now, my question goes to this issue of securitizing cap-and-trade funds. Until 2020, it's clear that there is continuous appropriation for the cap-and-trade funding. Securitizing is something that I have a great deal of questions for. We have finance here in case you're more comfortable. Your plan is to extend, for the legislature to extend, I assume, the cap-and-trade through 2050, take that funding, and then securitize it in order to meet this $5 billion cost chunk. My question is, what does it cost to securitizing? When I was on the Board of Supervisors, as you were, Jim, and we did the tobacco settlement monies, many counties rushed into doing that because it seemed so desirable. But I didn't support that because of the cost. That's one question I have. What is the cost of securitizing that amount of money for that amount of time? And secondly, who backs the funding if between 2020 and 2050 something happens to that cap-and-trade money? Where is the security for that? And that issue was raised by Mr. Thompson's group, and I appreciate it being raised. So I'd like to know a bit more about that.
Matt Almy, Department of Finance. I think this is going to be a little bit of a team effort here by me and my colleagues in the high-speed rail. So I think what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more broadly about the legal authority of cap-and-trade post-2020. I know that's been a topic, and then I'm going to turn it back over to talk more about kind of the specifics of securitization and how it relates to the business plan, if that's okay.
And if you don't have that information yet, I'd like to have it. And as part of what Jim is referring to, the chair is referring to as beefing up, I think that requires a little bit more beefing up as well, perhaps. So, go ahead.
So just as was mentioned before, the existing regulation, the existing Air Resources Board cap-and-trade regulation does in fact expire in 2020. That is true. However, it's also fair to say that the authority under AB 32 does provide authority to continue climate change strategies post-2020. So there is existing authority for post-2020. Admittedly, there is some legal uncertainty about maybe perhaps the scope of that post-2020 authority. The Air Resources Board is in fact holding workshops on its new regulation. So there is authority, and there are going to be continued discussions with the legislature about strengthening that authority post-2020, which of course does provide the necessary structure to achieve the securitization that is contemplated in the business plan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the High-Speed Rail Authority to talk kind of more specifically on the securitization question.
Well, I'll just start and say Chair Wolk, I've been involved in some securitizations in my life, and I think that the questions you raise are certainly appropriate ones. We do indicate in the business plan that without a securitization or borrowing, we can continue to go pay as you go. It would just simply take longer, of course, to build. And so I think we will probably end up supplementing this answer, but I would just say that at the time that one begins to look at the securitization, I think first of all, let me make one other point. I believe I understood Mr. Thompson to say something, and if I understood him correctly, I would agree with it. Irrespective of whether cap-and-trade itself goes to some point in time, there would need to be specific legislative authorization on securitization, I believe. My colleague Mike Rossi, who is the banker, can tell me if that's right or not, but in my experience, even if there was no question about cap and trade termination date, I think that we would probably need to come to you for authorization to securitize off of that. Although in the existing legislation, I guess the legislature did say we could finance with that. So it'd be up to the council to say whether you've already given us sufficient or we'd need something else. But I would just say to you, Madam Chair, that I think at the time that decision is made, it would need to be the balance of what benefit is there from bringing the construction forward versus the construction costs versus the risk and who is bearing that risk. And so I think you've laid out what those elements are. Our assumption is that there would be benefit in completing faster, but we would need to weigh all those things, and certainly that would be done in concert with the legislature.
And Mr. Thompson, you had a comment? Or Ms. Peter?
Oh, sure. Madam Chair, if I could, I believe your question overall was what is assumed in the business plan in terms of financing costs. And in our review of the business plan, we've identified that there's about $7.5 billion in financing costs in the plan related to the cap and trade securitization. We also, in terms of additional information, one of the things that we point out in our report is that the legislature may want to require more sort of all costs to be included in future business plans. Right now, the authority is complying with state law to provide capital cost estimates, but that doesn't include financing costs and doesn't include some of these other things. And as the project moves forward, you may want to think about amending the requirements in order to have them provide that information going forward. And I think that would help answer some of your questions in the future. With regard to can they securitize, I think we would think that first that legal question does need to be resolved. Even if it's resolved, we think that additional steps would need to be taken to facilitate the securitization. And I think Mr. Thompson wanted to speak to some of the specific ideas that the private sector had.
Madam Chairman, in the responses that the High-Speed Rail Authority received when they asked the private sector whether they could invest in the project, Barclays Bank, which I think had the best analysis of the cap and trade program, had a response. What they said was, no long-term standalone cap and trade financing is possible unless 4 threshold issues are resolved. First, CARB and High-Speed Rail Authority must prevail against pending legal challenges to the cap and trade program and to the use of GGRF revenues for a high-speed project. Second, the authority needs to create the technical plumbing in the law so that they have the authority to do this. Third, the legislature and CARB, respectively, must extend the cap and trade program in law and regulation beyond 2020. And fourth, the legislature must protect the 25% of GGRF revenue flowing to the authority from future impairment by the legislature as long as financing obligations are outstanding. So in English, what they said was, you got to extend it beyond 2020 to 2050, and you must take some action to ensure that there is a minimum amount of money that comes to High-Speed Rail Authority, and that minimum amount of money cannot be changed by future decisions.
For the duration of the commitment.
Yes. When securitization is a simple process. It is, I have a stream of revenue. How much cash will you give me to buy this stream of revenue? And the amount that cash that someone will pay is a function of the uncertainty in that stream of revenue. If it's absolutely certain for 30 years that you'll get $600 million a year, then you get one price that is paid for securitizing the money. If there is a major risk in that, either in amount or in when you will receive it or how you will receive it or the amounts you receive, then the amount, in effect, the cost of securitization goes up significantly. And the way in which that securitization is structured, or their ability to structure it, will go a long way to determine what is the value of the securitization.
Thank you. And I just wanted to compliment you on the high-speed rail peer review group, which has been extremely helpful in wading through this. I have just one other question. As I look at the realignment, and as I said earlier, I support the effort to fund it and move it forward. A driving force in this is the wonderful and dramatic expansion of the Silicon Valley phenomenon. My question is, when we are confronted with these costs, and we know that Silicon Valley has been, and the firms have been very, very generous in terms of San Francisco and transit and buses. Has anyone from the Valley come forward from that industry to assist with some of this effort, financial effort? Does it make any sense to try?
Madam Chair, I've met... A station, capital costs? Well, we don't have that IOU in hand at the moment. But I will say that working with Congresswoman Lofgren, I met with a number of key Silicon Valley companies. One of the companies made the statement that they have supported. I guess I would say politically supported virtually every transportation measure that's ever come forward. And those companies also provide transit assistance packages to their workers and a number of things like that. We're very enthusiastic about the reception that we're getting, not just in Silicon Valley, but also in the Central Valley. And if I might just take a moment here, I'm a Northern Californian and had not spent much time in the Central Valley before this project, before I became involved with this project. There are increasing conversations going on between Silicon Valley companies and economic development interests in Fresno and the Central Valley. And I think that not only the opportunity for housing and jobs connectivity, which is there, are there, but Silicon Valley companies have expanded their operations. Intel, for example, is up in Folsom. There are tremendous opportunities in the Central Valley, I think, not just as a housing location, but for investment there as well. So no one has said yet, gee, we're so excited about this that we're going to write you guys a $5 billion check to help build it. But I do think that the economic uplift and the opportunity that people are seeing not only for housing jobs balance, but also for a new region for economic investment are dramatic. And we're already seeing, because of the initial construction of high-speed rail, a very significant economic activity increases in the Central Valley. And we know that in addition to our conversations with tech leaders, that people in Fresno and other places are having those conversations as well. Ultimately, where this leads, I don't want to get ahead of myself on that, but I think your question is an important one, and we see real excitement in terms of the possibilities here that are being expressed in both areas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator Ross.